What I want to do is I want to give you a uh, an overview and really an idea of how geography affected certain areas in terms of their settlement, particularly the civilizations known as Egypt, Kush, and Canaan. What I have here is I have a map of the Fertile Crescent because there's a lot of similarities between these areas, and we want to start seeing if we can recognize some of the patterns involved with that. So you'd have areas like Mesopotamia, the areas that included Egypt and Kush, as well as the ancient civilization of Canaan. So that brings us to this idea of geography and the early settlement of Egypt, Kush, and Canaan. So let's talk about the environmental factors that we're going to include in this and the environmental factors that played a role in the settlement of these areas. The first one we want to take a look at is the environmental factor of water. As I always say, water is life. Water is the thing that keeps everything living. So people are going to essentially be attracted to where there's fresh water that they can use to stay alive. The second one is going to be topography, and that has to do with changes in the land. So, are lands mountainous? Are they desert? Do they have plains? And this just describes the land in helping people determine where the best place for their settlement might be. And then the third one is vegetation. And when we take a look at vegetation, we're talking about the different things that grow in certain areas, how those things can be used, and how that land where that vegetation can be used. So these are going to be the three environmental factors that we're taking a look at as we examine these different early ancient civilizations. So what I want to do is take a look at the environmental factors in the settlements of Egypt and Kush. You'll notice that there is a map here to the right. Take a look, make sure you know what the map is, as well as taking a look at the map key, and it gives you an idea of what some of the different things on the map are. In this case, we're looking, the green area is the Nile River Valley. So let's take a look at some of the environmental factors. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is the water. How was water a significant factor in the settlement of Egypt and Kush? Well, probably the most famous river, one of the most famous rivers in the world, is the Nile River, and we see the settlement along the Nile River for these two. Um, Very heavy. So what we have is this is a source of fresh water. They use it for farming. Not only were humans attracted to these areas, but animals as well. So hunting was very good in and around the Nile River. Now the other area that we see is the Mediterranean up in the upper left-hand corner of the map. The Mediterranean Sea was salt water, so it didn't have any significant effect on farming or human consumption, but it did have a lot of fish in it, so it was a good source of food for these early settlements. The second one that we take a look at is the environmental factor of topography. What we have here is we see the Nile River Valley, which was carved out by the Nile River. And along the river valley, the areas were pretty flat, but they were very, very fertile. So that really encourages settlement there in the Nile River Valley, the area that I have circled on the map. The wide plains were perfect for farming, and so that's why we see a lot of the earliest settlement taking place here in the Nile River Valley. Another significant factor here would be the surrounding deserts. The deserts ultimately provide protection from invaders. And what we're looking at here is we're seeing that the Nile River was this great water source in the middle of the desert. So it was kind of perfect for habitation of the earliest settlements of Egypt and Kush. So we see the role that the topography plays here in the settlement of this area. The third thing we want to take a look at is the vegetation. There were particular plants in the Nile River Valley that were very useful. It was things like papyrus and other reeds that grew there. And they were very useful for making things like baskets, creating roofs for houses. In some instances, we saw that people were making boats out of the reeds and papyrus that were available in abundance around the Nile River and in the Nile River Valley. So that gives you some of the environmental factors in the settlements of Egypt and Kush. Look specifically at some of these terms, and you should have a good idea of how geography plays a role in early settlements. I want to shift gears now and take a look at a different map. We're going to look at the environmental factors leading to the settlement of Canaan. So we're going up northeast along the shore of the Mediterranean Sea, and this is the area known as Canaan. First significant factor here is water. What we have here is we've got the coastal plains along the Mediterranean Sea were fantastic for things like fertile soil. There was a lot of fertile soil because it was rainy and wet along this area. Of course, the Mediterranean Sea again has lots of fish. So it was good for fishing, and then of course we see this coastline is very good for trade, so people could come and trade their goods with those in ancient Canaan. Another significant source of water was the Jordan River. What we have here is we've got a lot of hunting and fishing along the river. It was really their main source of fresh water because, again, the Mediterranean Sea was a salty body of water. But one difference that we see here in between this and the Nile River is that this river does not flood consistently or regularly. It had good land surrounding it, but not near as much as the Nile River Valley, which did regularly flood. But the Jordan River was a place for settlement and farming due to the vegetation and some of the fertile soil that was there. The last piece of the connection to water that we can make here with Canaan is the Sea of Galilee. It was good for fishing as well as had some surrounding fertile soil. And the thing about the Sea of Galilee that made it very significant was the fact that it's fresh water. So we see that the Jordan River flowed from the Sea of Galilee south into the Dead Sea. So we've got a couple of factors here in terms of understanding how water played a role in the earliest settlements of Canaan. The next one we'll take a look at is topography. Okay, so in terms of topography here in the early settlement of Canaan, we see a few different things. We see the Mediterranean and coastal plains, and then, of course, again, the Jordan River Valley. These areas were perfect for farming. So we see a lot of settlement happening here in terms of farming. Anytime that somebody is farming, that means they're staying put. They're not moving around like the nomadic herders, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. So the next thing that we see here is the hilly, dry areas were an alternative to farming. They weren't very friendly. They didn't have very fertile soil or flat areas to make farming easy. So what we see is some people turning to this idea of becoming a nomadic herder. And that means that you're moving around to find food for your herds of sheep, and other herding animals such as that. And we see them all over in the hills and even in some of the deserts here as an alternative to the farming lifestyle. Then we've got some of the mountains and deserts. We see the Lebanon Mountains to the north and the Negev Desert down to the south. These areas were very lightly inhabited. There were a few nomadic herders that roam through these areas. The Negev Desert's kind of unique in the fact that it does get some significant rain, which is very unlikely when we're talking about deserts themselves. But we do see some of this happening here. So we see how the topography plays a role here in the settlement of ancient Canaan. The last one we'll take a look at is vegetation. Vegetation in here, because of the hot, dry climate, it really prevented an abundant amount of plant life. So there wasn't very much plant life due to the hot, dry climate. Of course, near the Jordan River and the Jordan River Valley, there was some plentiful abundance of vegetation, but the Jordan River, not nearly as large as the Nile River. We don't see a huge significant amount of vegetation there, but it was in and around the Jordan River Valley. But what we do see is we see an abundance of what we would call grasslands, and that's perfect for these nomadic herders that were moving around the dry hillsides looking for food for their herds. And we see that here in the form of vegetation, which gives them an alternative to farming, which makes Canaan somewhat more unique in terms of what people did to sustain life. So there you have three of the factors in terms of Canaan. And what we see here is if we were to put H's by the areas where humans inhabited, you could see them all along the Jordan River, along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and some areas around the Sea of Galilee. The reason why you don't see the nomadic herders in certain places is because they moved around a lot, so we wouldn't say that they settled in that area. They were a part of this community, but they were moving around a lot more than really the farmers. So that gives you an overview of the environmental factors leading to the settlement of Canaan, Egypt, and Kush.